A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Shabbos at the Skizar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
We're together with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is quite different from our regular fare here. This is an introduction right now to what I'm going to post. Is a live recording. Live recording? Yeah, I guess so. It was a lecture I delivered at the Mir Yeshiva summer camp. So it was for Mir Yeshiva Bachra, Mir Yeshiva Talmidim in their summer camp program. It was 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago, in August 2023. And I was invited, I had the privilege to be invited to deliver a lecture. And the topic was the development of the yeshiva community in the United States post-war. And so what happened, I'll get to the content in a second, because I want to introduce the topic before you actually hear the edited lecture. Just the other day, a friend of mine invited me to speak on a podcast about the history of the yeshivas, and we got around to speaking about the development of the American yeshiva community post-war in the 20th century. And so the topic was on my mind, and I remembered that deep in the archives, I have this recorded lecture of this lecture that I delivered in the yeshiva summer camps. I figured that I'll give you more details about this interview that I did for this other podcast when it's posted. It's just not posted yet, so I will not spoil anything yet. But when it is posted, I will refer you to it, and that should be interesting as well. But once I was on the topic and once it was on my mind, I decided to post that original lecture as a podcast, because I think that this is a great topic, and I think it will resonate with the listeners of Jewish History Soundbites. I actually did have another episode already prepared for this week, so we'll push that off till next week. But this, I think, will post instead. I think it's interesting. I think it's a good topic, because when you ask someone about the phenomenal and almost miraculous growth of the yeshiva community in the yeshiva system, the yeshiva network in the United States, in the 20th century, especially in the post-war era, people will usually focus on internal developments, and especially they'll focus on internal leaders, heroes, role models, people like Rav Aharon Kotler and his role in the development of the American yeshiva world, yeshiva society in the post-war United States. Or Rav Shraga Feivel Mendlowitz through his works with Torah Umesorah pre-war, or in the development of Torah Umesorah, the network of day schools. If you would ask other people who say, what do you mean, Ner Yisrael, Baltimore, Rabbi Yaakov Yitzchak Ruderman and others, Rabbi Herman Neuberger, if you'd ask other people, they would say Reb Henoch Leibowitz and Chafetz Chaim, or the Friedricher Rebbe, Lubavitcher Rebbe, with Merkaz Le'Inyonei Chinuch, which was continued, of course, by his son-in-law and successor, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and their network of Torah schools and yeshivas and Tomchei Tmimim across the country and beyond, or the activities of the Satmar Rav and his investment in post-war chinuch in the Hasidic community and other great Rebbes. And there's so much to talk about in RJJ. What about Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan and YU and Rav Belkin and Rav Soloveitchik and so many others in their investment in the yeshiva world? And there's so much to talk about. And that's what most people focus on, and for good reason. Obviously, I don't need to explain why. That's a good reason. That's what we focus on because that's the reality. But what I chose to focus on in that particular lecture, and that's what's going to be this episode that you're about to hear, is that we don't live in a vacuum. We live in this broader context called the world and world history and world society. And while we love heroes and we love, thinking that the world revolves around us and it's all about what our rabbis and our heroes did. Of course, if we wanted to broaden the narrative a little bit, then we would speak about the ones who funded all those things, right? If it's the Irving Bunims and Stephen Kleins, or the Feuerstein family, or Shapiro family, or the Zev Wolfsons, or the so many others who funded the growth of the yeshiva community, that would also be internal. But what I focused on in this lecture is something completely different, and something that it's, I don't want to say counterintuitive or overlooked, is the broader societal shifts, developments, historical, gradual developments, or things happening in broader American society that facilitate the growth of the American yeshiva world. And that's the context, which surprises many, or surprised many in that audience that I spoke to. Things like the Vietnam War draft, things like LBJ's Great Society, things like the shift toward multiculturalism in American society, things like demographic growth and economic changes, all kinds of things like that, which facilitate the growth of the American yeshiva community. So I think that the topic is quite interesting. I do remind you that this, not only was it a live lecture, so the sound is a little bit iffy, so just tune up for that as soon as it transitions into that. It also was to a audience of yeshiva bachrim who were experiencing a very fun Bein Hazmanim. So a bit of a rowdy crowd. There's some clapping and applauding and yelling out questions in the middle. I did edit it. I edited out parts that were not relevant for a podcast audience. It was for yeshiva audience. It was more about the yeshiva and their summer camp, and so I cut out a whole bunch of minutes in the beginning. I cut out a few minutes in the middle when it kind of evolved into a Q&A, just happened to be. So I took that out as well. So I tried to edit as much as I can to make it more compact for a podcast audience. But, I hope you bear with me. And we will be back next week with a regular installment of Jewish History Soundbites. I hope you enjoy both the topic and the format.
Is that we Jews, understandably, I think every society is like this. First of all, we tend to live in a bit of a vacuum, or we tend to imagine a bit of a vacuum. We don't live in a vacuum, that's the difference. That any explanation, historical explanation, has to have some sort of internal Jewish historical mechanism to explain that phenomenon. Right? As if the rest of the world didn't exist, as if we're some sort of internal infrastructure that has no effect on it from the outside world. So that obviously is a fallacy. We're very much impacted by the outside world, and that's easily demonstrated in every single time period in Jewish history, in every single community, and there are millions of examples of it. The second thing is that every single society, it's not unique to Jews, needs heroes. And we need heroes, and it's important for us to have role models and heroes and people to look up to. And because of those two things, when they come together, so we have to have this super focus on individuals who are from our internal community, the Torah community, the yeshiva community, who they're the ones who did it, and there's no other factors involved. But in reality, there's a lot of factors involved, and they're not really individuals. They're societal, they're political, they're economic. There are all kinds of these big macro trends and processes that are, to be quite perfectly frank, they're pretty boring, but they're important, and they have a much greater impact on history and Jewish history than any individual can possibly have. I'm going to choose 4 of them to discuss. There may be more. These are the ones that I found. In the meantime, could be I'll do more research in the next couple of years. We'll find another 5, because there's always a confluence of factors. You'll very often hear people talk about what is the reason that this happened, or what is the reason that this chinuch thing is an issue. There is no such thing as the reason. There's always many reasons. There's always many factors that combine and come together to create a certain reality. So I'm going to discuss 4 of them. Okay? You ready? Here's number 1. What are we holding here? Okay, perfect. I exactly wanted to be here at this time. The first one... the first one is multiculturalism in post-war United States. Now, what in the world does that mean? What does that mean? Now, pre-war, the generation of the immigrants, the Great Immigration, that generation, the idea was coined during that time. By the way, Jews weren't the only immigrants. Millions of Italians and Irish and Germans and Chinese, and it was I said, unrestricted immigration to America. You didn't need a passport to come into the United States during that time. You needed a health check at Ellis Island and $50 cash. You had those 2, you came in. Can you imagine what that meant for immigrants? And during that time period, the philosophy of the United States, and a term was coined in New York during this time to explain this philosophy, and since then it's been used in many other contexts, the melting pot. Anyone hear that term? Familiar with that term, right? The melting pot. And the idea was, you become American. You were whatever, you were Italian, you were Chinese, you were Jewish, Yeshivos. Now you become American. And that wasn't just an ideal because you wanted to, you were forced to. It was societal pressure. You went to the public school system, you went into the factories, you adopted the American values, you adopted American heroes and role models. You adopted their holidays. You adopted their. You see it during World War II. You see all these young recruits talking about how they're finally completely American. They're comrades in arms. These immigrants, right? These Italian, Jewish, doesn't matter. All types of immigrants describing that when they were drafted during the war, World War II, and they had just moved here 10, 20 years before it, and they came from this immigrant home. Their parents were still old-fashioned, and they still spoke Italian or Yiddish or Chinese at home. Now they're American. Now they're in the army together, or when they go to college, it's the American ideal. And you had to. So it wasn't just that the immigrants wanted to, which they did, because they bought it. They bought into the melting pot ideal, hook, line, and sinker. But it was also, even if you didn't want to, you were almost forced into it. And interestingly enough, that trend changes in American society after the war, in American general society. And there's this new ideal of cultural diversity and cultural distinctiveness and multiculturalism and society and American society. And the pride of American society is that we're all so different, and we all come from such different backgrounds, and we all bring the wealth of our traditions and our cultures and our religions and our languages and our things, and we enrich American society with it. That's a trend. Now, society always goes through trends. This is a trend that is going through American society that starts in the 1950s, that they start to, American religious culture is changing, diversifying. There's a lot more, and it's happening in the Protestant world, and this is the beginnings of the evangelical and different Christian sects that flourish in this environment, that you can be different, and you can... By the way, what we refer to as one of the great tragedies of American Jewish life takes place in the 1950s. It's called the death of Orthodoxy outside of New York City. So we focus on New York City. Things were actually starting to get better at this time. Outside of New York City in the 1950s was called the death of Orthodoxy. Study American Jewish history, you'll find out about this. And during this time, every shul is converting to a conservative synagogue. And they're taking down mechitzas. And it's this booming of the conservative movement. This is the future of American Judaism. Now, so we have that perspective. And I'm going to flip the question. Why are so many Jews in the 1950s who are moving to the suburbs becoming members of conservative synagogues? Why don't they assimilate into American society and become more American, which was what they were doing before the war? Why are they all of a sudden flocking to conservative synagogues, temples, whatever you call them, right? It's because religious diversity and religious and multiculturalism is flourishing at this point. So American society is embracing and celebrating institutional religion in all its forms. The 1960s, it gets even more fun. There's a new emphasis on distinctiveness. This is the civil rights movement. This is the counterculture. I'm different. I'm distinctive. This is the rebellion against the American suburbia dream. The children of those veterans of World War II who moved to the suburbs after the war, and they're living the American dream, and we're American, we made it, and their parents were immigrants, their kids rebel. And then they're on the college campuses, and they're going to, they're saying, no, we can be different, and we can listen to different kind of music, and we can wear different kind of clothing, and fashion different, and this different, and we don't believe in this uni-value American thing anymore. And then American society ultimately embraces that. So religious groups were able to externally stand out in that environment without feeling un-American, which they had not been able to do before the war. Because you can wear your fur hat in the streets, even though it's August, and dress, with white socks and a silk coat, because, hey, that's cool. Yeah, you be different. Good for you. You can be different. And it's embraced at this time in American society, and it was glorified. So it was a new understanding of freedom of religion. In other words, freedom of religion was always part of American life, but freedom of religion in the post-war era wasn't just that you have the right to practice it, is that you have the right to be proud of it and to flaunt it, and that it's not any less American because of it. You're just as American, and you're doing it in your way, and fakert, it enriches American society and culture to have all this, excitement around. By the way, I'm not saying anything about today. I'm talking about what was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, right? So this enabled all kinds of, like I said, Christian fundamentalists and evangelical groups to flourish, but also orthodoxy to flourish, and any very conservative factions of orthodoxy, not conservative Judaism, right? Conservative factions, ultra orthodox, right? Very, very orthodox. It created that right atmosphere. It created an atmosphere that private schools could be celebrated. That private religious schools, Catholic schools, Jewish schools, they're able to fight for their rights and get them. Rav Shraga is testifying in the Supreme Court in the early 60s about yeshivas and day schools, and he's the representative of all religious private schools working together with the Catholic Church. Early 1960s, I think it was 64, 65, someone could check the exact date when it was. His testimony to Congress, or Congress, not the Supreme Court, to Congress. Rav Shraga, the head of Agudas Yisrael, right? He's talking about private education and its place in American society, right? And that's an important development, and that all can exist, and therefore your private education it doesn't agree with the supposed American values of college and career, because your private religious school doesn't encourage college or doesn't mandate college or even discourages college, and your ideas of career might be different than what the supposedly authentic American is. The pre-war, that couldn't exist. Because the melting pot. You better get your kid into public school, you better send him to college, you better get him on a career, and he's going to work hard, and there's going to be a chicken in every pot and a car in every driveway. Herbert Hoover. That was a slogan. You need to live the American dream. And in the multicultural distinctiveness, diversity atmosphere of the 1950s and 60s, you can have your private education that doesn't mandate college, that has different ideas of career, and you're still American, and we still welcome you, and society is okay with it, which is very different than the pre-war. Now, we can only imagine what type of impact this general atmosphere has, a positive impact on the growth of the yeshiva and Torah world. Because this enables things to happen. Now, why wouldn't we have known about this? Why is it so crazy? Why is it such a big chiddush to us? Yeah, of course, American society has an impact. I thought of 3 reasons why this is a problem. This is a problem, this reality I just described. And why it needs, why we would be hesitant to discuss it in our education, in our Shabbos table, in our value system. And number 1, because it diminishes the role of individual heroes, which it shouldn't. We don't want to diminish the role of individual heroes. If there would be no Rav Aharon Kotler, then all this acceptance wouldn't help at all, because there's no one building Torah, right? This maybe creates a more inviting atmosphere, but you need someone to do it. You need to have someone with that vision, right? So it could be perceived as a threat, as diminishing the role of individual heroes. That would be problem number 1. Problem number 2 is that it makes our Torah community in certain ways similar to other religious groups, which we don't want to be that. We want to be V'simli Sgula Mikol Ha'am. We're different. We're proud of our difference. And of course we're different. We have a different Shulchan Aruch. We're Am Sgula. We're better. We're Mlachas Kainim V'Gai Kali. You don't need, just because there are some societal things that the weather also impacts everybody, right? We seem to be okay with that. So this shouldn't be an issue either, but it is. And the third, and this might be the greatest one, is that what we're essentially saying is that American culture can, in very specific circumstances, facilitate growth of the Torah community and be inviting and not only threatening. And in very important of orthodoxy in the modern era, starting from the Chassam Sofer until today, is that the way we define Yiddishkeit in the modern era is by boundaries. That is the way Yiddishkeit in the pre-modern era was following Shulchan Aruch, was keeping Shabbos. It was a very fluid definition. But in the modern era, it became a more defined thing. It's boundary. How do I define my orthodoxy, my religiosity? By the boundaries. By what I don't believe in and what I do believe in. By the us and them. By where I stand. And we're very proud of where we stand, and we should be. And look how much we've accomplished. But the idea that there could be this, what is supposed to be a threatening culture that we fight against, the permissiveness of American society, all the problems that American society, no one's denying all the problems of the 50s and 60s. Again, I'm not talking, nothing's talking about today. I'm talking about 50s, 60s, 70s. All those issues, it's because we can maybe see more complexities and nuance. Say, well, some parts were problematic and threatening, and I define my religious identity by creating those boundaries. But it could be that there were parts of American culture that facilitated a certain atmosphere that enabled the growth of the Torah community. It's not the end of the world. It's crazy. But that would be 3 reasons why we would want to negate this external factor from the story of the narrative of American Yeshiva Torah society post-war. The external factor of American society that had an impact on the growth of the Torah and Yeshiva world after the war is the growth, this is economics, I hope I don't bore anyone to pieces here. The growth of social benefits starts from the New Deal, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Social Security, all these things, but much more, that's already 1930s. You start to see the effects of it more in the 40s and 50s. 50s is a time of economic boom, but even more in the 1960s. Following the assassination of JFK in 1963, Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, becomes the President of the United States. He was the great legislator. He had served in Congress, he had served in the Senate, he had served as a vice president. He knew the ins and outs of American government, possibly more than any other president in U.S. history. And I think you can check this up in the presidential trivia books, I think he succeeded in getting Congress to pass more legislation than any other president in history. I think. Remember, no contemporary politics and no contemporary anything for that matter. So one of his visions is the Great Society, he calls it, which was such a sweeping legislation of social benefits, welfare, and housing benefits, and most of the social basket of benefits that the American government at the federal level has today, and to a certain extent it trickled down to the states as well. So even state welfare benefits come from the 1960s, come from Johnson. Now, that is a huge change in American life, because it would be impossible to live a Torah life, especially a Kayla life, but even many positions in the Torah world, and chinuch and all kinds of things like that, or in Hasidus, in a Hasidic life, without all these economic incentives. And we know that in Israel, much better than that, right? We know what it means here. And even in America, where it's much less than it is in Israel, it had a great effect. And they're able to get certain ways, they're able to get that even for private education, definitely for individuals, for people, for institutions, all kinds of food benefits and all kinds of tax breaks and nonprofit stuff. And I mean, I can't even go through all the legislation, not because it's boring and we don't have time, but also because I don't know it. But that trend in American society started by LBJ that creates a huge trickle effect in the economics of the American system that enables people. The reason you couldn't afford to have your kid go to yeshiva during the Great Depression is because you would have starved. Right? I'm going to get to economic growth in general soon. That's another factor. But I'm talking specifically about the social benefits. Now, he could go to yeshiva. He could even learn in Kollel for a few years if he's able to somehow make it get by. And don't get me wrong, you need a lot of Mesiras Nefesh to learn in Kollel, even with all these wonderful social benefits. But you're able to do it, and institutions are able to do it, and yeshivas are able to capitalize it, and yeshivas in America have been very, very savvy in being able to maximize the benefits of this system, till today. And that's important. So that's the second factor. Now, since that's such a boring factor, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. The next one is much more fun. In fact, this was my first discovery years ago. This got me thinking about this whole topic, and it's so exciting that when you hear it, you're like, wow, that makes so much sense. Listen to this: the Vietnam War and the Vietnam War draft. The United States goes into the Vietnam War. It's gradual. I'm not going to go through the whole history of the Vietnam War because Binyamin told me he wants that for next year's topic. After the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which is also LBJ, and there's an escalation of the war, and then the draft starts. And now No one likes war, any war, but everyone hated the Vietnam War. And no one wanted to get drafted. It was an awful place to be. No one believed in the war. World War II was even more violent, but they're like, you feel like you're doing a big mitzvah, you're defeating the Nazis, Here no one believed in it. Why are we even there? Why does this make sense? What are we doing there? Right? And there's the whole anti-war movement because of that. Now, one of the great things about the American law, which exists in Israel, and it's always a contentious subject in Israel, and will probably, always be a contentious subject in Israel, is divinity school deferments, which in Israel is yeshiva guys not going to the army. But in America, it's called divinity school deferments. If you're a clergy studying in, let's say, a Catholic institution for the priesthood, then you're a divinity school student, and you can defer the draft. So, all American yeshivas were rabbinical schools. And every single student, 100% of their students, were eligible for the divinity school deferment. In every war. World War II was the same thing. Whatever yeshivas existed during World War II. And in the Vietnam War, no parents wanted their kids to go to this horrible war. And no yeshiva guy, no students wanted to go, no college students either. No one wanted to go. So parents, until the war, draft. Let's imagine the average scenario. And we're talking about the frum families. Talking about the religious families, the ones who are living in Brownsville, and in Brownsville, the 60s, they're already leaving. Let's say in Borough Park, in Williamsburg, in all these places, they're living there. They're the frum ones. They're still keeping Shabbos. They're the stark ones. But they're American. And they're even willing to not send their kids to public school. They send their kids to RJJ and Torah Umesorah. And they're the frummest members of American society. They're even willing to send their kids to Yeshiva High School. Because Yeshiva High School, they're still taking general studies and passing all the New York State, in Chaim Berlin and in RJJ and in Torah Umesorah, right? But after high school, Ad Kan, and this we know this for a fact, the frummest in the 1950s and 60s were not letting their kids continue after high school. And guess what? If yeshiva kids would not have continued after high school, they would all go to college and all go to work, you would not have an American Torah community that you would have today. You need to be learning. Today we're talking about how many years in Kail. I'm talking about after high school, right? Beis Medrash we call it, right? 2, 3, 4 years until you get married to learn full time without any other distractions. It didn't exist for a few individuals. There was 100 Bachram in Lakewood, maybe another 50 in Tells. How many in Torah Umesorah were post high school? They're all going to college at night. Also, maybe still like that. I don't know. But how many? How many guys were doing it? Right? So it didn't exist, and the parents were very strong about it. And most yeshiva guys were about it. It wasn't just the parents were forcing them. Is that everyone wanted to go? I went to yeshiva. Look, they looked at themselves as the most frum people in society. Most guys on their block went to public school. Some of them went to a yeshiva day school, but then went to public high school. But here I'm going to yeshiva day school. I'm going to yeshiva high school. Torah Umesorah. I'm going hearing shiurim from Migdal Yashar and Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. Actually, they were post high school. Whoops. Rav Pam. I'm hearing shiurim from Rav Pam. And now I'm going to college. That's it. And I'll be a frum Erel Chabal Bas, Shomer Shabbos, sending my kids to yeshiva too. They saw themselves as the frummest people in society, and for the most part they were. And now those same people, the Vietnam War draft, their parents are saying, hey, you better stay in yeshiva. And the guys are saying, we are staying in yeshiva. And the Vietnam War is probably the single most important, this Vietnam War draft, and the fear of being sent to the Vietnam War is probably the single most important factor of the growth of the American Yeshiva world in the post-war. I'm positing. I'll give you one cool story. I told you I like stories. There was a guy who I know his son. I'm not going to say his last name. His first name was Joe. Polish Holocaust survivor who grew up in a Chassidish home, but he I don't know, we'll call him like traditional after the war. He wasn't really Shomer Shabbos. He was traditional, had a lot of respect for Yiddishkeit, had a lot of warm feelings for Yiddishkeit, maybe did some ceremonial stuff at home, Shabbos night and whatever, but I don't know if he was really Shomer Shabbos. Either way, he wanted his kids to have some sort of Orthodox education because, a Haimish Yid from after the war, sent him to public school, didn't talk to him. But he wanted, he didn't plan on any of them really being from afterwards, so they were going to, go, they're going to be traditional like him. And he was terrified of the Vietnam War. When his kid was finishing high school, he was going to go get drafted. This guy, he lived in Far Rockaway. And at that time, the Chaim Berlin had left Brownsville because the neighborhood went bad, and they had moved to Far Rockaway. And they were in the process of moving from Far Rockaway to Flatbush, which was a new emerging Jewish neighborhood at the time. And this guy didn't know what to do about his son, this Joe. And he approached one of the senior Rebbeim in Chaim Berlin, a fellow by the name of Rav Shraga Feivel, and said, I need someone to save my son from the draft. And he can't go to Chaim Berlin. We're barely from, we're like Shomer Shabbos, barely. Create some sort of yeshiva for my son. So this is a guy who's barely from, who's asking for post-high school yeshiva. He wants a post-high school yeshiva. Son should be learning Torah. Why? Because he doesn't want him to be drafted. And he organized a whole group of parents similar to him. And that yeshiva became Shar Yashiv. Okay? So that's a yeshiva that started because of the Vietnam War draft. I'm not really focusing on that. He was the president of the board for many years, this guy. He remained very close with it, never really becoming that from, but he was very fromish. His son became a Rav, got smicha, became a Rav, a Talmud Chacham, a Paisik. That son who went to yeshiva because he was avoiding the Vietnam War draft and started Shar Yashiv, he's my cousin, and I know him very well. Either way, so I'm talking about the regular yeshivas that people were going to anyway. They first of all increased enrollment. More and more people were going to yeshiva. But more importantly, the ones who were going were staying post-high school, were staying in Beis Medrash. And they discovered that these yeshivas, that Rav Aharon Kotler, and that all these other Gedolei Yisrael put all their sweat and guts and blood and Mesiras Nefesh into, were wonderful places. So even after the Vietnam War draft was over, there was already a trend. The yeshivas are awesome, and the rebbeim are amazing, so we'll stay. And the next brother is going to stay. And you tell your neighbors, we only did it because of the draft, but it's not a bad idea. So they learn a couple of years before they go to college. What's the big deal? Right? They're great places, these yeshivas, right? So remember, these are the fromest people in society, so they have respect for yeshiva, right? So all you needed was that push, and the push was the Vietnam War draft. Liam is going to kill me. So, what? 8 years, if I'm not mistaken, but I could be off by a year or two. Long enough to create a trend, right? If it was a year or two, it wouldn't have been enough, right? By the way, and this is not the topic, and it's a controversial topic, so as if this is not controversial, but there will be those who will argue that the long-term yeshiva and kollel system in Eretz Yisrael was also somewhat facilitated by the fear of being drafted. You needed the yeshiva deferment, and therefore you stayed another year in kollel, and another year in kollel, another year again, and everyone stays in kollel, and 100% of society stays in kollel, which never existed before in Jewish history. There will be those who will argue, and I'm not going to expose my position on this, that the draft here played not exactly the same role, because very different circumstances here, I'm not going to get into it, but at least for the long-term kollel and for how widespread kollel is, that everyone goes, that the draft plays a role here too. So you see that the concept is a real thing. Without getting into that. The fourth one is, and I saved the dafka for the last, even though the last one was my favorite, and I think also the most important. But the reason I saved the last one as the fourth one is because we should leave off with a tam back to the internal stuff. This is, I'm not sure if this is an internal factor or external. Maybe we'll decide here together. American Frum community experiences demographic growth in absolute numbers, especially in New York City. And with demographic growth, because the 1950s America are an incredibly prosperous time, it's one of the best decades of economic growth in American history. So there's, for the first time, again, demographic growth of Orthodox Jews, so there's more of them, and economic prosperity brings that there are people of means in the Frum community. So there are ways to fund yeshivas, and more yeshivas, and more chadarim, and more Torah Umesorah, and more this and more that. In the pre-war, you had both things working against you. The pre-war, you had the Great Depression. The 1920s was a really early stage. It was almost nothing getting off the ground. And then 1929 is the Great Depression. So you have no economic growth, no prosperity, and almost no Orthodox Jews, or relatively. This is before the demographic growth. Now, the people who are funding yeshivas in the early years are really not even religious, but they have a lot of respect for Rabbanim. The few who did, right? There were some Frum ones. Irving Bunin said he's very Frum. Never had yeshiva education, but very, very Frum. But there were those who were barely even religious, and you look at the people who funded the Postwar Rav in the early years, that we have a lot of data on. Some just mentioned, even though he was in Israel or in Europe, even at that time, or Ram Kamenovich or the Mir, or all the other people who were fundraising in the early days. They were fundraising primarily from people who weren't even religious, but who had warm feelings for the idea that there should be places that Torah is studied and yeshivas and Rabbanim, all these needs. Maybe it's guilt, other things like that, but not very Frum. The 1950s, because of economic prosperity, and 60s, economic prosperity and demographic growth, there are more people of means in the Orthodox community that can fund it. And when there's funding, that facilitates growth. That's very simple. You need money to build. That's what Rav Aharon Kotler was saying with his $10. Imagine today, look how much money there is in the Frum community. You have speeches being given at the Mir dinners about matching millions of dollars for Chalukah and doubling, and it's incredible, right? Rav Aharon Kotler was begging for the next $10. When's the next $10 going to come? But with prosperity, and these things are gradual processes, obviously. People don't become millionaires in a day, and they don't start funding yeshivas and building yeshivas. They're processes that start in the late 50s and go through the 1970s and 80s until there's this massive explosion of Torah in yeshivas across America. But you need the funding, and you need people who are Frum enough, because there's only so much you can rely on these traditional people you need people within. You need Frum people within who understand and appreciate Torah to go ahead and fund Torah. And that starts to happen then. Before that, it simply didn't exist. Or it existed on such a minute scale that they couldn't be built. So that economic reality, which I'm not sure if it's an external force because I'm focusing on the growth of the American economy, or it's an internal story because it's Frum Balabatim, who are starting to make money, who appreciate Torah, and are now willing to fund these institutions. And that's a beautiful story, and somewhat untold, about all these people who got up and decided to fund Rav Aharon and to fund all these yeshivas and further yeshivas in the 60s, 70s, 80s, more yeshivas that were able to grow. So, I think we'll end with this, and I think that, just to emphasize one last time, I think this just helped us broaden our understanding, made it more colorful, exciting, interesting, nuanced, complex, but not in any way to ever detract from the great heroes like Rav Aharon Kotler and Shraga Feivel, who were the ones, the pioneers, who had the vision that Torah could be built, and everything that we have and flourishes from that. Thank you.